New York City was no longer New York. It had become a brutal painting rendered in dust, blood, and silence. The skyscrapers that once stood proud now leaned like drunken giants, their steel frames exposed like the ribs of a long-dead beast. The sun set behind the shattered skyline, staining everything in a bleak crimson, the color of the apocalypse. 72 hours. That was how long it had been since the battle began. 72 hours of thunder, of punches that shook the earth to its core, of magic and technology colliding in a symphony of destruction. And now, only absolute stillness remained. In the ruins of Times Square, Captain America lay there. The legendary vibranium shield had been split in two, one half driven into the ground like a gravestone, the other resting just inches from Steve Rogers' calloused hand. His eyes were wide open, but the light behind them had gone out. Across his chest, the white star on its field of blue had been torn open by a deep gash, as though something had tried to rip his heart from his ribcage. Not far away, Mjolnir lay motionless on the cracked earth. Not resting in any ordinary way, it had been impaled by Thor's own lightning bolt, pinned to the concrete like a butterfly skewered through its wings. Beside the hammer, the god of thunder knelt in the posture of a defeated warrior. His golden hair was matted with dust and dried blood. One eye was shut tight, the other wide open, staring up at the ashen sky. Those eyes that had once held the power of 1,000 storms were now nothing more than shattered glass. At the edge of the square, a massive figure lay curled on the ground. Hulk, or rather Bruce Banner now, lay unconscious in shredded clothes. His body had returned to its fragile human form, bruises spreading across pale, sallow skin. The strangest thing was the expression on his face. Not rage, but bewilderment, as though the beast within had been forcibly dragged out before it had the chance to roar one last time. Black Widow and Hawkeye lay side by side, their hands nearly touching. Their weapons were scattered around them, broken arrows, dulled blades. They had fought to their final breath, but their opponents seemed to have known their every move before they made it. And Tony Stark was still alive. Barely, but alive. The Iron Man armor was nothing more than a twisted heap of metal clinging to his battered body. The arc reactor on his chest flickered weakly, one pulse every 3 seconds, like the heartbeat of a dying man. The faceplate had shattered, revealing Tony's blood-soaked face. A shard of metal was lodged in his right cheek, but those brown eyes were still open, still aware. And they were fixed ahead with an expression that even those closest to him had never seen on Tony Stark before, pure, undiluted betrayal. Because standing before him, stepping slowly through the bodies and the rubble, was Dr. Stephen Strange. The cloak of levitation wrapped around Strange was torn to shreds, its red fabric hanging like the wings of a wounded bird. Yet Strange's stride remained steady. The famously trembling hands of the sorcerer, the lasting consequence of the car accident years ago, were now completely still, his slender fingers hanging loose at his sides. The most frightening thing was not the wounds on Strange's body, it was his eyes. Those eyes that had once held warmth, dry wit, and a touch of arrogance belonging to a genius were now cold as two shards of glass. His irises, a pale gray, reflecting no light whatsoever, as though the soul behind them had departed long ago, leaving behind only a machine that could walk and carry out its purpose. Tony tried to move. Pain tore through his chest. A wet, gurgling sound rose from his throat. He wanted to speak, but his lungs were filled with blood. Even so, Tony forced himself to drag his body forward, his bare hands, stripped of any armor, clawing at broken fragments of concrete, leaving a long smear of blood across the ground. Starter, Strange. Tony's voice crumbled like glass. You. It was you. Strange stopped. The distance between them was barely 3 meters. The sorcerer looked down at his dying comrade at his feet, and for a single moment, a flicker of something passed across his face. But it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Yes, Strange said. His voice was flat and dry, like dead leaves swept across asphalt by the wind. It was me. 6 months earlier, the Camartage Sanctum was bathed in an ethereal green light. Dr. Strange sat cross-legged in the meditation chamber, the eye of Agamotto hovering before his chest, sending out magical pulses that made the surrounding air tremble like a pond disturbed by a thrown stone. Strange had been here for 3 days. 3 days without food, without sleep, without movement. His eyes were open but unseeing, blind to the room around him. They were looking through time, through space, through the countless realities unfolding in parallel. Threads of time wove themselves before him, each one a possible future, each knot a decisive moment. 14,605 futures. He had examined every single one. In the first 14,604, everything ended in the total annihilation of the multiverse. Not just Earth, not just the galaxy, but everything, every reality, every dimension, every timeline, all of it wiped out by an entity that even Dormammu himself feared. An ancient hunger that had slept since before the universe was formed was now awakening. And then he saw it, the 14,605th future. In that future, the universe survived, but the price to be paid. Strange opened his eyes. Tears the color of gold, tears laced with magical energy, ran down his cheeks. His trembling hands gripped the edge of his cloak, knuckles gone white. "Wong," he called out, his voice breaking like glass. His closest friend, the keeper of the Kamar-Taj library, entered the room with a look of deep worry. Wong had stood outside the door for 3 days, keeping watch so Strange would not be disturbed. "What did you see?" Wong asked. Though Strange's silence already said everything. The color slowly drained from Wong's face as Strange recounted what he had witnessed. When Strange reached the part about the only solution, Wong stepped back. "No," Wong shook his head firmly. "There is another way. We will find. We have already looked." Strange cut him off 14 million times, and there is only one path. Then we walk that path together. You do not have to. I cannot tell them, Wong. Strange rose to his feet, his legs trembling after 3 days of meditation. I have tried. In every future where I speak the truth, they all choose to sacrifice themselves to save me. Steve throws himself into the killing blow. Tony detonates the reactor. Thor lets himself be swallowed whole. And the plan fails. Every single time. Wong grabs Strange by the shoulders, forcing him to look him directly in the eyes. "Then let me do it. Let me be the one to carry it out. You do not need to bear this alone." "Wong." Strange's voice softened, and for just a moment, Wong saw his friend, not the Sorcerer Supreme, but Stephen Strange, the man who had once been arrogant enough to turn away patients who could not afford his fees, now willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of the universe. "You are not strong enough, and I cannot lose you." That was the last time they spoke as friends. In the months that followed, Strange disappeared from Kamar-Taj. He appeared briefly across other dimensions, gathering ancient enchantments that even the Ancient One had refused to use. Enchantments of shadow, spells of betrayal, incantations written in the blood of creatures that had gone extinct since the primordial age. Every night, Strange went without sleep. He practiced his hand forms until fingers that once trembled became terrifyingly perfect. He traced magical circles in the air until they were burned into his retinas. And in those rare moments of rest, he stared at photographs taken with the Avengers after the battle with Thanos, gatherings at Stark Tower, candid moments of laughter with Peter Parker. He wondered whether he could go on living after doing what had to be done. "But why?" Tony rasped. Blood from his mouth ran down his chin, dripping one drop at a time onto the cold concrete floor. "Why did you do this?" Strange knelt down beside Tony. His movements were slow, almost gentle, like a doctor tending to a patient rather than an enemy who had just destroyed that person's teammates. When Strange reached out his hand, his fingers emitted a faint orange glow, the light of healing magic. "Don't," Tony tried to push Strange's hand away, but his body would no longer obey him. "Don't touch me." "I am not healing you, Tony," Strange said quietly. "I am only easing the pain. You deserve an explanation before everything ends." Tony closed his eyes. A single tear, a real tear, not blood, rolled from the corner of his eye and merged with the wound on his cheek. "Steve, Thor, Bruce, all of them. Are they all ready?" "They are not dead," Strange answered. And for the first time his voice wavered. "Not yet. They are suspended in a state between life and death, frozen at the boundary. I need them. I need their power." "Their power?" "The entity is coming, Tony. Something 1,000 times worse than Thanos. It does not want to kill half of all life. It wants to erase everything, every reality, every timeline, everything that has ever existed, exists now, or ever will exist." Strange paused and swallowed dryly. "I have seen 14 million futures, and there is only one way to stop it." Tony opened his eyes. The betrayal in them slowly gave way to something else, a painful understanding. Because Tony Stark, a genius whose mind could process billions of calculations per second, had begun piecing it all together. Strange had created a phantom enemy, a false threat. He had gathered all the Avengers into one place, not to fight, but to a performance, Tony whispered. All of this was just a performance. I needed them in one place. I needed their energy, Thor's strength, Steve's will, your intellect, Bruce's rage, Wanda's soul. I needed all of it to forge a seal powerful enough to contain the entity. But I could not do that while they were still conscious. They would not let me sacrifice myself. They would throw themselves in to die in my place, and the plan would fall apart, so you betrayed them. I planned every step, Strange continued, his voice as level as if he were reading a medical report. Shadow enchantments to suppress Thor's power, preventing him from summoning lightning. Ancient spells to awaken the demon within Bruce, causing Hulk to lose control and exhaust himself. An illusion of Bucky dying horribly right in front of Steve. Steve never truly got over his guilt about Bucky, and that shock was enough to paralyze his will to fight. And me? Tony asked, his voice hollow with bitterness. What did you do to my armor? Nothing at all. I simply made use of a vulnerability you left behind. 5 years ago, when you upgraded my systems, you secretly installed a backdoor into your own armor as a safeguard in case I ever turned on you. I knew about it. I waited until you activated it, and then I used that same backdoor to get inside. Tony closed his eyes. He remembered. He remembered that night at Stark Tower when Strange came asking him to upgrade the magical defense systems. They had shared whiskey, talked about sacrifice, about the weight of knowing the future, and Tony, with his instinct to always prepare for the worst, had quietly embedded a piece of code into the system, code that could shut down Strange's magic, if it ever came to that. Strange had known. From the very beginning, he had known, and he had used it against Tony himself. You really are a bastard. Tony let out a weak laugh, the laugh of a man who had made his peace with his fate. You know something, Strange? I used to think you were the most arrogant person I had ever met. Turns out, I was wrong. You are the loneliest. For the first time since the battle began, the mask Strange wore cracked open. His eyes, those eyes as cold as ice, suddenly glistened. His fingers, which had stopped trembling after months of relentless practice, began to shake again. I tried, Tony, Strange said, and his voice was no longer the voice of the Sorcerer Supreme. It was the voice of Stephen Strange, neurosurgeon, the man who had lost everything and found a new reason to live. I tried telling everyone. Across 14 million futures, I tried every possible way. I tried the truth. I tried lying. I tried pleading. I tried giving orders. And in every single future, all of you chose to die in my place. Not because you doubted my plan, but because you did not want me to carry this burden alone. Strange raised a hand to wipe his face. When he pulled it back, his fingers shimmered gold, tears mixed with magic. But this burden is mine to carry. I am the one who saw 14 million futures. I am the one who knows what happens if I fail. I cannot let any of you bear that. I cannot. What about Wong? Tony asked. Where is Wong? Strange said nothing. His silence was more frightening than any words could have been. Strange, what did you do to Wong? Wong found out, Strange said, his voice reduced to nothing more than a whisper. Last week. He found the books I had hidden, the dark enchantments. He tried to stop me. He said there was another way. He said he would come with me, that he would help me find a solution. And you, I had to erase his memory, Strange cut in, and his voice shattered like glass. Not just the memory of the plan, all of it, everything about me. About Kamar Taj, about our friendship. He no longer remembers who I am. Right now, he is working at a small grocery store in Hong Kong, believing himself to be an ordinary shopkeeper, knowing nothing of magic or cosmic wars, and he is happy. Tony looked at Strange, truly looked at him, perhaps for the first time in all the years they had known each other. He saw the crow's feet around Strange's eyes, far deeper than his actual age warranted. He saw the silver threading through his temples, which had not been there 6 months ago. He saw the shoulders curved inward under the invisible weight of 14 million futures, and he understood. What are you going to do next? Tony asked, his voice having grown calm again. I will absorb everyone's life force temporarily. It will not kill them, but it will draw them into a deep hibernation. That energy, combined with the time stone, will create a seal strong enough to lock the entity outside of reality. After that, Strange paused. After that, I will disappear to another dimension, live out the rest of my life as a recluse. Or perhaps I will let the seal drain me completely. I have not decided yet, and no one will ever know the truth. They will think you are a traitor, a mass murderer, the most wanted criminal in history. Better that than they know the truth and spend the rest of their lives feeling guilty for not being able to save me." Tony was silent for a long moment. The reactor on his chest flickered, its pulse slowing. There was not much time left. "Strange," Tony said, and a faint smile appeared on his blood-soaked face. "Do you remember, after the battle with Thanos, when we sat drinking on the roof of Stark Tower? You said that if you had the chance to do it all over again, you would still choose the same path. I laughed in your face. I called you a lunatic. I remember. Now I get it." Tony broke into a long coughing fit, blood spraying from his mouth. When he spoke again, his voice was nothing more than a rattling wheeze. "There are things bigger than all of us. Do it. Do what you have to do. But remember, if you die, I will come find you in hell and break your face." Strange did not answer. He could not. His throat had closed up, and golden tears fell onto Tony's chest, merging with the faint blue light still flickering from the arc reactor. He stood. Rings of magic began to form around him, not the familiar orange of Kamar-Taj sorcery, but the blazing gold of the Time Stone. Energy radiated outward from his body, spreading like golden threads, each one connecting to a hero lying motionless across the battlefield. Thor, the thread of strength. Steve, the thread of will. Bruce, the thread of rage. Wanda, the thread of soul. And Tony, the thread of intellect. Each thread ignited, carrying the life force of each hero flowing back towards Strange. His body convulsed violently as the energy poured in, the power of a god, the will of a super soldier, the rage of a monster, the soul of a witch, and the intellect of a genius. All of it converging inside him, and Strange felt as though he were being torn apart from within. But he did not stop. Above him, the sky began to tear open. A massive rift appeared, not a physical crack, but a fracture in the very fabric of reality itself. Through that rift, a formless darkness was crawling out, vast enough to blot out the entire horizon. It had no fixed shape, at one moment like an enormous storm cloud, at another like millions of mouths gaping open, at another like a single eye as wide as the entire city. This was the entity of destruction, the ancient hunger, the end of all things. And Strange faced it alone. The battle did not take place in the physical world. Strange plunged into the rift, carrying with him the full combined power of the Avengers. He became a weaver, using the golden threads made from his teammates' life force to mend the tearing fabric of reality. Each stitch was an incantation. Each knot was a memory. Steve raising his shield before battle, Thor laughing loudly in the halls of Asgard, Bruce brewing tea in the laboratory, Tony clapping him on the shoulder after a hard-won victory. The most beautiful memories, the moments of family, all of them used as thread to save the universe. The entity roared. It had no voice, but its roar echoed through Strange's mind, whispering promises of power, of liberation, of a reality where he would never have to carry this burden again. Strange ignored all of it. He kept stitching, kept weaving, kept giving. And then, after a stretch of time that could not be measured, perhaps 1 second, perhaps 1,000 years, the rift sealed shut. The entity was locked outside of reality, howling in desperation. The seal was complete. Strange fell back down into Times Square. His body struck the concrete hard, and he no longer had the strength to rise. The cloak of levitation wrapped around him in tatters so complete it was barely recognizable. His hands trembled violently, the shaking having returned, worse now than it had ever been before. Around him, the heroes lay still. They were not dead. Their chests still rose and fell, their hearts still beat, but they were in a state of deep hibernation, frozen between life and death. It would take months, perhaps years, before they woke. And when they did, what would they remember? What would they think of Strange? He did not know, and he would not be here to find out. Strange dragged himself upright. Every movement was agony. He looked out across the battlefield one final time, his teammates, his friends, his brothers and sisters in arms. He whispered something, perhaps an apology, perhaps a farewell, perhaps nothing more than their names, spoken aloud like a prayer. Then he opened a gateway. It did not lead to Kamar-Taj, did not lead anywhere on Earth. It was a small, dark opening into an unnamed dimension, the place where he would live out the rest of his days as a recluse, haunted by the memory of what he had done. Just before stepping through, Strange stopped. He turned and looked at Tony, the last of his teammates still conscious, if only for a moment longer. Their eyes met. Tony blinked. A slow, deliberate blink, a farewell, a forgiveness, a promise to keep the secret. Strange nodded. Then he stepped through the gateway, and it closed behind him with a whisper. Times Square fell into silence. The last light of dusk had faded, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the sky. Stars that should no longer have existed were it not for the sacrifice of one man. And in a distant dimension, on an unnamed planet, beneath a sky holding 3 moons, Stephen Strange sat alone on a rocky outcrop. He looked up at the unfamiliar stars and wondered whether someday someone would understand, whether someday someone would forgive. But even if they never did, he had made his peace with that. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you all so much.